The phone screen lit up the dark kitchen at 2:47 in the morning, and when I saw my sister's name, I almost didn't answer. Almost. But I had been waiting for that call for 4 years, 3 months, and 11 days, not because I was bitter, though I had every right to be, but because I had read the fine print back in September of 2020 when our mother's attorney handed me a certified copy of the will, and I had discovered something that nobody else in that room had thought to look for. Not my sister Renata, not the estate attorney our mother had used for 30 years. Nobody. Just me sitting in the back corner of that conference room with a legal pad and a highlighter, because that is who I am and that is who I have always been, even when every member of my family treated me like I was the lesser daughter, the practical one, the one who didn't need anything because she was always so capable. I let it ring 4 times, then I picked up. Nadia, my sister said, and her voice was the kind of voice that only arrives at 2:47 in the morning when a person has been crying for hours and has finally run out of other options. I need help. I pulled out a chair. I sat down in my dark kitchen. I said, let me check something first. And I smiled at the wall because 4 years of patience had just paid its first dividend. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here with me tonight. I want to take a moment to welcome everyone watching. Whether you are joining from New York or Houston or London or Cape Town, drop your city in the comments. I genuinely love seeing where you all are. And if this is your first time finding this channel, I want you to stay because what you just heard is not the end of the story. It is barely the beginning. What happened between my mother's estate closing in September of 2020 and that phone call 4 years later is a story about patience, about paperwork, about a woman who has dismissed her entire life learning to turn her invisibility into a weapon. Some people who were there that night still say I was too harsh, that I took it too far, that I should have just helped my sister when she needed me. I want you to hear everything before you decide whether they are right. To understand why that 2:47 phone call mattered so much, I have to take you back much further. I have to take you back to the house where I grew up, where the rules were different depending on which daughter you were. My name is Nadia Ferreira Okonkwo. I am 38 years old, and I am the older of two daughters born to Lucinda Ferreira and Gerald Okonkwo, who divorced when I was 9 and my sister Renata was 6. Our mother kept the hyphenated name for both of us because she said it looked distinguished on paper, and our mother cared enormously about how things looked on paper, even when the reality behind them was something entirely different. Growing up, I was the daughter who got good grades and a small acknowledgement. Renata was the daughter who got a smile and a story told at dinner parties. I do not say this with bitterness anymore. I have done enough work on myself to say it plainly and move on, but I say it because it matters for everything that comes later. The pattern was established early and it never changed, and I think that is important to understand. Families do not operate on logic, they operate on mythology. And in our family's mythology, Renata was the beautiful one, the sensitive one, the one who needed protecting. And I was the one who would be fine. I graduated from the University of Michigan with a degree in finance and a minor in contract law. I got a job at a mid-sized investment advisory firm in Chicago, and then a better job, and then a better job after that. By the time I was 30, I was a senior portfolio manager with a client book worth roughly $42 million in assets under management, and I was earning $218,000 a year before bonuses. I had a 2-bedroom apartment in Lincoln Park that I owned outright. I had a retirement account that would have made my 22-year-old self cry with relief. I had built quietly and without ceremony a genuinely stable financial life. My mother knew I was successful. She knew because I told her carefully and with context the way you tell someone important news when you want them to understand it. And she always said the same thing. She would nod and pat my hand and say, "That's wonderful, Nadia. You've always been so practical." And then she would ask about Renata, who was, at that point, living in a rented apartment in Scottsdale on a combination of our mother's generosity and a series of jobs in the wellness industry that never quite stabilized into careers. I want to be fair to Renata here because she is not simply a villain in this story, even though she behaved like one for a significant portion of it. She was, in many real ways, a victim of my mother's choices before she became a perpetrator of her own. My mother had raised her to believe she deserved to be taken care of. That was a genuine damage done to her. I saw it clearly even then. It did not make her behavior acceptable, but it is important to know. Renata Ferreira Okonkwo was 35 in 2020. She had married a man named Declan Marsh when she was 28, and they had separated after 3 years without children, which my mother treated as a personal tragedy and Renata treated as a narrow escape. She had lived in Scottsdale, then briefly in Denver, then back in Phoenix. And by 2020 she had moved back to the Chicago area partly because our mother's health was declining and partly because I suspected even then she had a sense that the estate needed tending. Renata had never been a planner, but she was perceptive about money in the way that people who have always depended on it tend to be. She could smell a financial wind change from 100 miles away. Our mother, Lucinda, had been diagnosed with early-stage vascular dementia in March of 2019. She was 71. She was still sharp in some moments and genuinely confused in others, and the deterioration was slow and then, in her final year, fast. I flew to Chicago every 6 weeks. I sat in doctors' offices. I reviewed her medication schedules and talked to her neurologist and asked questions that the doctors appreciated and my mother sometimes resented. I organized her finances, consolidated her accounts, made sure her bills were on autopay, reviewed her insurance. I did all of this while working full-time, while managing a full client load, while maintaining my own life and my own financial obligations. Renata moved into my mother's house in February of 2020. She said it was to help with care. And in fairness, she did provide care. She was there physically in a way that I, living in Chicago while my mother was in Oak Park, simply could not be day to day. She drove my mother to appointments. She cooked. She kept my mother company in the evenings. I do not want to erase that, but she was also, I would later discover, doing other things during those months, things that had nothing to do with care. Our mother died in July of 2020. It was a Tuesday. I had spoken to her on the Sunday before, and she had been having a clear day. She had talked about a trip we had taken to Portugal when I was 12, and she had laughed about a bad hotel we'd stayed in, and I had stayed on the phone with her for an hour and a half because I knew, the way you know these things without being able to say why, that we were getting close to the end. She died in her sleep 2 days later with Renata in the next room. I was called at 4 in the morning. I drove to Oak Park in under an hour. By the time I arrived, Renata had already called the estate attorney. That detail lodged in my brain and stayed there. The estate attorney was a man named Harlan Price, who had handled our mother's legal affairs for more than 30 years. He was 70-something, white-haired, and very professionally kind in the way of people who deliver bad news for a living and have made their peace with it. He scheduled the reading of the will for 2 weeks after the funeral in his office in Evanston. I sat in the back corner with a legal pad and a yellow highlighter because I had learned, over 15 years of working with financial documents, that the most important things are always in the sections nobody bothers to read. Our mother had an estate valued at approximately $1.47 million. The house in Oak Park was worth roughly $700,000. There was a brokerage account with just under $400,000. There was a life insurance policy with a death benefit of $220,000, and there was a smaller savings account of about $50,000. Harlan Price read the will in a steady, professional voice that gave nothing away. The house went to Renata. The brokerage account went to Renata. The life insurance went to Renata. The savings account went to Renata. I received, per the terms of my mother's will as executed in March of 2020, 1 month after Renata moved in, 5 months before our mother died, the sum of $0. Nothing. There was a single line that read, "My daughter Nadia Ferrer Okonkwo, being of independent financial means and having demonstrated throughout her life the capacity for self-sufficiency, requires no material inheritance from this estate, and I therefore make no bequest to her." Harlan Price kept reading. Renata did not look at me. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was staring at a fixed point somewhere above the attorney's head. I wrote the word March on my legal pad, then I wrote 2020, then I circled them both. I was not going to make a scene in that office. I was not going to give anyone the satisfaction of watching me come apart. But I was also not going to pretend that I had not noticed what I had noticed, which was that the will had been executed 1 month after Renata moved in, while our mother was in cognitive decline, and that the language citing my independent financial means was not something my mother would have come up with on her own. My mother had many qualities. Legal precision was not among them. Someone had provided that language. Someone who knew that a reference to financial independence would make a legal challenge more complicated and expensive and uncertain. I wrote one more thing on the legal pad before I closed it. I wrote, "Read the fine print." If you have ever sat in a room and received the news that someone you loved chose to give you nothing, and done it without flinching, without giving anyone the reaction they might have expected, you know exactly what that particular kind of stillness costs. It is not peace. It is a decision, a very deliberate, very expensive decision to save your energy for what comes next. Harlan Price asked if there were any questions when he finished reading. Renata had several. They were about transfer timelines and probate schedules, and whether the life insurance would be expedited. I said nothing, and eventually Harlan looked at me with something that might have been sympathy and said, "Nadia, is there anything you'd like to ask?" I said, "Yes, can I get a certified copy of the full document, including all addenda and the execution record?" He said, "Of course." And something shifted in his expression, very slightly, barely perceptible. He wrote something on his notepad. Renata looked at me for the first time. Her expression was careful. She said, "That's standard, isn't it? She's just being thorough." And she smiled at Harlan Price the way she had always smiled at men who had authority over things she wanted. I drove home and called my attorney. My attorney was a woman named Gloria Tran, who I had used for real estate transactions and contract reviews for 6 years, and who was, in my honest assessment, the most methodical and relentlessly prepared legal mind I had ever encountered. When I called her at 7:15 on a Thursday evening and said, "My mother just died and I got nothing and the will was executed a month after my sister moved in while my mother had diagnosed dementia," Gloria said 3 words: "Send me everything." That was the first conversation of what would become a 14-month process, and what we found over those 14 months was not exactly what I expected to find. It was, in several ways, worse. The certified copy of the will arrived by courier 9 days after the reading. I read it twice completely at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a fresh legal pad. And on my second read through, on page 7 of a 9-page document, in a section governing the disposition of what my mother's will described as trust instruments and financial vehicles established during the testator's lifetime, I found something that made me set my coffee cup down very carefully. There was a reference to a revocable living trust established in December of 2019 that was not mentioned anywhere in the public estate documents. It had a reference number, it had a trustee designation, and based on the structure of the language, which I understood because of my background and which most people without a finance or legal background would have simply skimmed over, it appeared to govern financial accounts that were separate from the probated estate. A revocable living trust, for those who aren't familiar, does not go through probate. It transfers outside the public process directly to whichever beneficiaries the grantor designated, which means it would not necessarily appear in the will reading. It would not necessarily be disclosed unless someone asked specifically about it, and its assets would not be part of the estate valuation that Harlan Price had quoted in his office. I circled the reference number. I called Gloria Tran the following morning. "I need to know everything about this trust," I said. "I'll file a discovery request and contact the trustee institution," Gloria said. "Give me 10 days. It took her 12. What she found took my breath away for exactly 4 seconds, and then I wrote it down and made it into a data point, because that is how I survive things that would otherwise destroy me. The trust had been established in December of 2019 with an initial funding of $340,000, transferred from my mother's primary brokerage account in 3 tranches over 90 days. The named beneficiary was Renata Ferrer-Okonkwo. The trustee was an institution I will not name here, but which was respectable enough that the trust itself was entirely legitimate on its face. The trust was revocable, meaning my mother had retained the right to change it at any time while she was living. She had not changed it, and because she had not changed it, upon her death it had transferred to Renata automatically, without going through probate, without appearing in Harlan Price's office, without any disclosure whatsoever. So the estate Harlan Price had described, $1.47 million, had not included this trust. The actual total that had passed to Renata upon our mother's death was not $1.47 million. It was $1.81 million. And then there was the question of when exactly the trust had been funded, and who had been in the house during those 90 days, and who had been present during my mother's appointments with her bank, and whether the quarterly cognitive assessments in my mother's medical file, which I had obtained through proper channels with the help of my power of attorney, which I had held since June of 2019, reflected the same mental capacity that the trust documents would have required for valid execution. They did not. I sat with that information for a long time, not because I was unsure what to do with it. I was entirely sure. I sat with it because I had loved my mother, and understanding that she had been manipulated while I was filing expense reports and catching flights and reviewing medication schedules, that part was not strategy. That part was grief. I gave myself one evening to feel it. Then I called Gloria Tran and said, "Tell me what our options are." She told me that a challenge based on lack of testamentary capacity was possible but expensive and uncertain, that a challenge based on undue influence was possible but required evidence of specific conduct, that the combination of the two, if we could document the timeline carefully enough, would give us significantly better standing. "Document how?" I asked. "When was the trust executed?" Gloria asked. "Who was present? What was your mother's cognitive status at the time? Who accompanied her to the bank? Who introduced her to the attorney who drafted the trust?" I looked at my notes. Renata moved in February of 2020. The trust was initiated in December of 2019, so the funding started while Renata was not yet in the house. Who was visiting regularly in December of 2019? I thought about it. I checked my calendar. I had visited twice that month. And I remembered something, a detail that I had catalogued at the time as unremarkable and had not thought about since. During my December visit, Renata had been there for a weekend. She said she was visiting for the holidays. She had arrived with a woman I didn't know, whom she introduced as a friend named Petra, and they had taken my mother out to lunch one afternoon. I wrote down the name Petra with a question mark. "I need to request the records from the trust institution," I told Gloria. I need to know who was listed as the accompanying party when my mother opened the trust. I'll file the request, Gloria said. If her dementia was as documented as you're saying, and if someone accompanied her specifically to execute a financial instrument that benefited them at your expense, we're looking at a very different conversation. She paused. Then she said, Nadia, be patient. Don't tip them off. If Renata knows you're looking, documents disappear. I said, I understand. And I did. I had been underestimated my entire life. Being underestimated was practically my native language. I knew exactly how to look like I had accepted something when I was, in fact, building a case. I sent Renata a condolence card, handwritten warm, that said I hoped she was finding peace and that the estate process hadn't been too exhausting. She texted back a heart emoji. I texted back another heart emoji and did not think about it again for 3 months. The records from the trust institution came back 6 weeks later. The accompanying party listed on the account opening documentation was not Renata. It was a woman named Petra Voswang. I did not recognize the full name, but I had the first name, and I had a memory of a weekend in December, and I had a sister who had always known how to delegate the parts of a plan that could be traced back to her. I called my mother's neurologist, Dr. Amara Nwasu, and requested a copy of the cognitive assessment from November of 2019, the closest assessment to the December trust execution. I had the authority to request it because of the power of attorney I had held since June. Dr. Nwasu's office sent it within a week. The November 2019 assessment placed my mother at a stage where she could manage familiar daily routines, but showed significant difficulty with novel financial decisions, complex paperwork, and this was the phrase that I read 3 times and wrote down in capital letters, is susceptible to influence from trusted individuals when decision-making involves unfamiliar institutional contexts. I held that piece of paper for a long time. Susceptible to influence from trusted individuals. And Renata had sent a trusted individual, a woman my mother didn't know well enough to be suspicious of, a woman who could not be directly connected to Renata without investigation, to accompany my mother to a bank during a window when my mother's own doctor had documented her cognitive vulnerability. That was not someone acting spontaneously out of need. That was a plan. I added it to the file. I did not call Renata. I did not confront anyone. I went to work on Monday morning and managed my clients and attended my meetings and ordered a salad at my desk at noon, and I was, to all visible appearances, a woman who had accepted her mother's unfair will with the quiet dignity of someone who was, in her mother's own words, of independent financial means. And that was the first layer, the obvious injury, the one I had known about since that office in Evanston. But it was what came after, in the 18 months following my mother's death, that turned my quiet, methodical documentation project into something that I had not entirely anticipated. It started with the house. My mother's house in Oak Park was a 3-bedroom craftsman that she had owned outright since 2005. She had maintained it meticulously. The neighborhood was good and getting better, and by 2020 the market value was $700,000 on a conservative estimate. It passed to Renata as part of the estate without complication. Renata did not live in it, as I had half expected she might. Instead, she announced in September of 2020, 2 months after our mother's death, that she was listing it for sale. She texted me to tell me this, not a phone call, a text. As though she was telling me about a dentist appointment. Going to list Mom's house, the text said. I know that might be hard. Let me know if you want anything from it first. I read that text in my office on a Wednesday afternoon, and then I set my phone down face first on my desk. She was selling our mother's house for $700,000, and she was offering me the chance to take something from it before the sale, as though the question of what I might be owed was a matter of furniture selection rather than inheritance law. I texted back, thanks for letting me know. Let me know if you need anything from my end. I did not go to the house. I knew that if I went to the house, I would not be able to maintain the tone I needed to maintain, which was the tone of a woman who had accepted a difficult situation gracefully and was moving forward. I was not moving forward. I was building a case. But those two things can look identical from the outside when you are disciplined enough. The house sold in November of 2020 for $720,000. Renata cleared approximately $680,000 after closing costs and commission, and she used a portion of it to put a down payment on a condo in River North that I later discovered cost $1.1 million. She sent me a photo of the kitchen. It was very beautiful, white marble countertops, a 6-burner stove, the kind of kitchen that exists to be photographed rather than cooked in. Isn't it gorgeous? She texted. I feel like Mom would have loved it. I looked at that text for a long moment, then I wrote back, it's stunning, you deserve it. And the thing is, I meant that, not sarcastically, not strategically, but genuinely. I believed that Renata deserved a beautiful kitchen. I just did not believe that she deserved it at the cost of what she had taken to get it. Those two things are not in conflict. You can think someone deserves good things and also believe that the way they acquired those good things was wrong. Both can be true at the same time. But I am getting ahead of myself. The second betrayal came in February of 2021, and it was different in character from the first. The first had been something done behind closed doors, in the absence of witnesses, in the gap between my mother's diagnosis and her death. The second was done in full view of people who knew both of us, and it was done with a kind of casual confidence that told me Renata had decided there were no consequences coming. Our extended family gathered in February of 2021 for what had traditionally been a post-winter gathering at my Aunt Rosaline Ferradilo's house in Evanston. Rosaline was my mother's older sister, 78 years old, sharp as ever and deeply invested in family dynamics in the way of people who have been watching a family operate for long enough to see the patterns clearly. She knew me, she knew Renata. She had not been present at the will reading, but she had heard what happened, and she had called me in August of 2020 and said, in her precise, unhurried way, "I want you to know that I see what was done." I had thanked her. She had said nothing else about it, and neither had I. The February gathering was about 20 people, cousins, aunts, a handful of family friends who had known my mother. It was the first large family gathering since the funeral, and the topic of the estate came up the way these topics always come up in family gatherings, which is sideways and without warning. My cousin's husband, a man named Troy Wakahissa, asked me at the drinks table how the estate process had gone. He asked innocently, meaning no harm, and I said, neutrally and without detail, that it had been complicated. Renata was across the room. She heard the exchange, and she walked over. She put her hand on my arm and she said, in the voice she uses when she wants to sound warm while controlling a situation, "It was complicated because Mom made some choices that were hard for Nadia to accept, but I think we're in a good place now." And she looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as proprietary, the expression of someone who believes they have the narrative and is waiting for you to confirm it. Troy looked uncomfortable. I smiled. I said, every estate has its complications. Renata kept her hand on my arm for one beat too long, then she moved away to talk to someone else. My Aunt Rosaline appeared at my elbow approximately 45 seconds later. She handed me a glass of sparkling water and she said very quietly, "She's been telling people that you were consulted on the will." I turned to look at her. "That I was consulted," Rosaline nodded. "That Lucinda discussed it with you. That you agreed it was fair given your financial situation." I was very still for a moment. I said, "That is not true," Rosaline said. "I know." She sipped her water. "I wanted you to know what is being said, so you are not surprised when you hear it from someone else." I thought about the legal pad and the highlighter and the certified copy of the will and the 14 months of documentation I was quietly accumulating. I thought about the trust records and the woman named Petra Voswang and the neurologist's assessment from November of 2019. And I thought about the particular audacity required to not only take everything, but to then construct a narrative in which the person you took it from had agreed that it was fair. I said, "Thank you, Rosaline." She said, "Don't let her write the story." That sentence stayed with me. I turned it over for days. Don't let her write the story, because that was exactly what was happening. Renata was not simply a person who had benefited from an unjust situation. She was actively, deliberately rewriting the history of it in real time, seeding the family with a version of events in which I was not a wronged party but a consenting participant. She was not defending herself against a challenge I hadn't yet made. She was preemptively discrediting me in case I ever decided to make one. That told me two things. First, it told me she was smarter than I had credited her with being. And second, it told me she was scared. People who have clean consciences about the things they've done don't spend the 8 months after those things happened building a counter-narrative. They move on. Renata was not moving on, she was fortifying. I filed that observation under useful and moved on to my next step. The third incident, the one that shifted my understanding from this is about the estate to this is about who Renata is, happened in May of 2021, and it involved a woman named Constance Adichie, who had been my mother's closest friend for 32 years. Constance was 70 years old, Nigerian British, a retired art teacher, and one of the most fundamentally decent people I had ever met. She and my mother had been friends since the 1980s when they had served together on a hospital fundraising committee. She had been present at every significant event in my family's life for 3 decades. She had known me since I was 7 years old. She had come to my college graduation, and when I had bought my first apartment, she had sent me a hand-painted card that I had kept on my refrigerator for 2 years. She had also, I learned from Gloria Tran in May of 2021, contacted an estate attorney of her own 2 months after my mother's death, because she had witnessed my mother signing a document during a visit in October of 2019, a visit during which Constance said my mother had been confused, had asked Constance twice who she was, and had been accompanied by a woman Constance did not recognize who had guided my mother's hand to the signature line. The document my mother had signed, Constance believed, was related to financial accounts. She had not known at the time what it was. She had been disturbed enough by what she witnessed to mention it to her own attorney, who had advised her to retain her notes about the incident. When Gloria reached Constance and explained what we were investigating, Constance said, and I am quoting Gloria's summary of the conversation, "I have been waiting for someone to ask me about this." She provided a written statement. She provided the notes she had made in October of 2019, dated and signed, describing my mother's confusion, the presence of the unidentified woman, and the document signing. She described the woman tall, dark-haired, wearing a gray jacket, and provided details that were, when compared to Petra Voswang's publicly available professional profile, a reasonable physical match. I met Constance for coffee at a cafe in Wilmette in June of 2021. She walked in with the particular posture of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and is about to set it down. She sat across from me and she put both hands flat on the table, and she looked at me with an expression I recognized, the expression of someone who had been a witness to something wrong and had been powerless to stop it in the moment and was relieved finally to be useful. "Your mother loved you," Constance said. "I want you to know that. Whatever else happened, she was proud of you. She told me that 2 weeks before she died when she was having a good day. She said, 'Constance, Nadia's going to be just fine. She always figures it out.' And she meant it as a compliment." Constance folded her hands. I think she would not have been fine with what was done. I covered her hands with mine. This was one of those moments that had nothing to do with money, nothing to do with strategy or documentation or the case I was building. It was just a woman who had loved my mother telling me that my mother had loved me, and that mattered more than any piece of evidence I had gathered. I said, "Thank you, Constance. That is, thank you." She said, "Tell me what you need from me." What I needed from her was exactly what she had already provided: the written statement, the contemporaneous notes, and her willingness to be deposed if it came to that. What I got in addition to those things was a piece of information I had not expected, which was that Constance had seen Renata at the house 3 times in October and November of 2019, before Renata officially moved in February of 2020, on visits that my mother had mentioned but that Renata had never disclosed to me. Extended visits, overnight visits. Visits during which, according to my mother's comments to Constance, they had spent time going through paperwork together. I added this to the file. I was now, by June of 2021, approximately 11 months into a documentation process that had produced a certified copy of the will with its revealing language, the trust institution records showing Petra Voswang's involvement, my mother's November 2019 cognitive assessment, Constance's written statement with dated notes, and a timeline of Renata's visits to the house during the trust execution window that predated her official move-in by months. I had not yet confronted Renata. I had not yet told a single member of my extended family what I was building. I had not yet given any indication to anyone that I was doing anything other than quietly grieving and gracefully moving forward. At family gatherings, I smiled. At birthday dinners, I brought thoughtful gifts. When Renata texted me photos of her condo renovation, I sent back heart emojis. And every week, I had a standing 30-minute call with Gloria Tran, who was the only person in my life who knew the full shape of what I was doing. In August of 2021, Gloria told me that we had enough for a legitimate challenge. Not a guaranteed win, these cases are never guaranteed, but a legitimate challenge with a reasonable probability of success. The question, she said, was whether I wanted to pursue active litigation or whether there was another path I might prefer. I asked her what she meant by another path. She said, "Litigation will take 2 to 3 years. It will be expensive. It will destroy your relationship with your sister permanently. It will be public record. Is that what you want?" I thought about that for a while. I said, "What's the other path?" She said, "We wait. We keep the case warm. We preserve the evidence. And we wait for Renata to need something from you." I looked at the wall of my kitchen, where I had a corkboard with a timeline and a set of index cards that I had been building for almost a year. I thought about my mother's words, relayed through Constance. "Nadia's going to be just fine. She always figures it out." I said, "How long do we wait?" Gloria said, "Based on her spending patterns and the assets she received, and based on what you know about how she makes financial decisions, I would estimate 3 to 4 years. I said, "And if she needs something and she comes to me," Gloria said, "then you are holding a very interesting hand of cards." I said, "Let's wait." That decision, made at my kitchen table in August of 2021, with a cup of coffee and a corkboard full of index cards and a phone call with the most methodical attorney I had ever met, was the axis on which everything else turned. I did not go to litigation. I did not confront Renata. I did not leak information to the family. I waited, and while I waited, I worked. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say I worked. I do not mean I obsessed. I do not mean I spent every waking hour on this. I mean that I continued doing what I had always done, managing my career, maintaining my relationships, building my financial life, while also in the background maintaining the case with the same methodical attention I gave to everything else I cared about. Once a month, I reviewed the documentation file. Once a week, I spoke to Gloria. Every 3 months, I had a formal meeting in her office to assess where things stood. The documentation file, by the time Renata called in October of 2024, contained 47 individual documents, including the original will, the trust records, Constance's statement, the cognitive assessments, bank records obtained through discovery, and a detailed chronological narrative of the timeline that Gloria had helped me prepare. It contained 3 depositions from Constance, from Dr. Nwasu, and from a bank employee who had been present during one of the trust account transactions and who had, when approached properly, been willing to describe what she remembered. It contained a memorandum from Gloria assessing the legal options available and the likely outcomes of each. And it contained one additional thing, which I had obtained in September of 2023 after a conversation with Harlan Price. I need to tell you about that conversation because it matters for everything that happened next. In September of 2023, 3 years after the estate had closed, I contacted Harlan Price and asked if I could meet with him. I told him I had some questions about the estate administration that I had been sitting with and that I was not pursuing any immediate legal action, I just wanted to understand some things. He agreed to meet somewhat cautiously at his office in Evanston. Harlan Price, when I sat across from him, was a man in evident discomfort. He was 74 years old and he had the look of someone who had recently had a difficult conversation with himself and had not yet resolved it. He offered me coffee. I accepted. He spent an unusual amount of time pouring it. I said, I want to ask you about the timeline of the will's revision. He said, of course. I said, the will that was executed in March of 2020, the one that was read in your office, was it the first will you had prepared for my mother? He said it was the most recent version, yes. I said, were there earlier versions? He said, yes, several over the years. I said, in the earlier versions, the ones before the March 2020 revision, what were the terms? He looked at his hands. He looked at the window. He looked at the ceiling. And then he looked at me and said, in the versions prior to the March 2020 revision, the estate was divided equally between you and your sister. I let that sit in the room for a moment. I said, when was the most recent prior version executed before the March 2021? He said, February of 2019. I said, 14 months before the final version. He said, yes. I said, and between February of 2019 and March of 2020, who initiated the revision? He set his coffee cup down, very slowly, the way you do when you are buying yourself a moment. He said, I received a call from Renata in January of 2020. She said your mother wanted to discuss some revisions. She arranged the appointment. I said, was my mother accompanied to that appointment? He said very quietly, yes, by Renata. I said, did you have concerns about my mother's capacity at that appointment? He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I had questions. Your mother she had good moments and less good moments. At the appointment in March, she was articulate. She seemed clear about what she wanted. He paused. I asked her directly whether she had discussed this with both daughters. She said yes. I said, and did you ask me? He did not answer that. I said, Mr. Price, I want you to understand that I am not here today to pursue any action against you. I am here because I want to understand what happened. And I want you to know that whatever happened, I believe that you were, in your own way, also misled. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said something that I wrote down in my notes the moment I left his office, word for word, and which became the final piece of documentation in my file. He said, your sister told me before the appointment that you had already been informed and were in agreement with the changes. She told me your mother had called you and discussed it with you and you had said it was fine given your financial situation. He pressed his lips together. I should have verified that independently. I did not. I said, no, you should not have taken her word for it. I stood up. Thank you for seeing me. He said, Nadia, and I turned. I'm sorry. I said, I know, and I left. That conversation gave me the final piece of the mosaic, not just what had been taken, but how it had been taken, the full architecture of it. Renata had not simply moved in with a mother in cognitive decline and waited for the estate to shift in her favor. She had actively arranged the will revision appointment. She had told the attorney a lie to prevent him from contacting me for verification. She had brought in a third party, Petravas Wang, to handle the trust establishment with enough separation that the direct connection to her would require investigation to uncover. She had spent the months after our mother's death building a family narrative in which I had been a consenting participant in my own exclusion. It was, in its way, remarkably thorough. I did not admire it. But I was capable of recognizing it for what it was. I added Harlan Price's account to the file. I told Gloria. Gloria said, do you want to move forward now? I said, no, we wait for the phone call. She said, you're sure it's coming? I looked at what I knew about Renata's spending patterns, her lifestyle, the rate at which she was burning through an inheritance that had seemed, at the time of the estate, enormous. The River North condo, the renovation, the trips that showed up on social media. Business venture she had announced the previous year, a wellness consulting practice that had a beautiful website and, as far as I could tell, very few actual clients. The credit card debt that a mutual cousin had mentioned carefully in passing. I said, I'm sure it's coming. It came 14 months later, 2:47 in the morning, my kitchen, the phone screen lighting up the dark. When I said, let me check something, Renata was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she said, check what? Her voice was confused. She had expected me to say yes immediately, or to say no with sympathy, or to ask questions about her situation. She had not expected me to pause and say I needed to check something. That was not the Nadia she had mapped in her mind, the capable, quiet, gracefully accepting sister who sent heart emojis and brought thoughtful gifts to family dinners. I said, I just need to pull up some files. Can I call you back in the morning? A reasonable morning hour. She said, Nadia, it's urgent, the situation is, and her voice cracked in the way that voices crack when the need is real and the fear is real and everything around them has finally compressed to a point of genuine crisis. I said, I understand, and I'm going to help you. I just need to pull up some files. She believed me, or she needed to believe me, which is sometimes the same thing. I hung up. I sat for a moment in my kitchen. And then I called Gloria Tran, who answered on the second ring because I had told her months ago that when the call came I would need her immediately, and Gloria Tran was the kind of attorney who answered her phone at 2:47 in the morning for a client who had been preparing for 4 years. It came, I said. Gloria said, tell me everything. I told her. And while I talked, I opened my laptop and I pulled up a document that I had been refining for 14 months, a document that detailed with full supporting references every element of what had been done, what had been taken, what had been lied, and what, under the terms of the trust instrument established in December of 2019, I was now in a position to request, because here is what I had found in the fine print. Here is what I had highlighted in yellow on page 7 of the certified copy, in the section governing trust instruments and financial vehicles established during the testator's lifetime. The revocable living trust that had been funded with $340,000 and had transferred to Renata outside of probate, the trust that had been established using a woman named Petra Voswang as the accompanying party at a bank appointment, while my mother's own doctor had documented her susceptibility to influence, that trust contained a clause. A clause in standard trust instrument language that almost no one reads because it is buried in the boilerplate, in the definitions section, in the paragraph that describes the trust's relationship to the broader estate. The clause stated that in the event the trust was challenged on grounds of undue influence or lack of grantor capacity, and in the event a challenger could demonstrate through contemporaneous documentation that the grantor lacked capacity at the time of the trust's establishment, the trust assets would become subject to equitable distribution as determined by a probate court, and further that the costs of any such challenge, including legal fees, would be borne by the current trust beneficiary if the challenge was upheld. What that meant in plain language was this: if I challenged the trust and won, Renata would not only lose the trust assets, she would also owe my legal fees. And what I had spent 4 years quietly and methodically building was a case that, in Gloria's professional assessment, had a very high probability of being upheld. Renata was calling me at 2:47 in the morning because she needed $340,000, and I was holding in a 47 document file on my laptop the evidence that she had received almost that exact amount from a trust that I could challenge. I did not think this was a coincidence. I thought it was an accounting. The following morning at 9:15, I called my sister back. Her voice had the particular texture of someone who had not slept. I asked her to tell me what had happened. She told me. The condo, she said, had an underwater mortgage. She had refinanced twice and the terms had become unmanageable. The wellness consulting business had not scaled the way she had projected. She had credit card debt in the range of $60,000 to $70,000. She had liquidated most of the brokerage account on a series of investments that had not performed. She needed $340,000 to avoid losing the condo to foreclosure and to consolidate the remaining debt into something serviceable. I listened to all of it. I took notes. I said at the end, I understand, that's a lot to be carrying. I want to help you, Renata. But before I can talk about what I'm able to do, there are some things we need to talk about first. She said, of course, what things? I said, our mother's estate. The silence that followed was not a brief pause. It was the kind of silence that has weight in it. The kind that means someone is reassessing everything about the conversation they thought they were having. She said, Nadia, that was years ago. Mom made her choices. I can't change what I said, I know you can't, but I'd like you to hear some things I've learned since then, and then I'd like to have a different conversation about what help looks like. I paused. I'd like you to come to my attorney's office. Would you be willing to do that? Another pause. Then why your attorney's office? I said because what I want to share with you is in legal documents, and I think it will be easiest to have a professional context for the conversation. She said, Nadia, you're scaring me. I said, I don't want you to be scared. I want you to be informed. Those are different things. She came to Gloria's office on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks later, in the kind of careful, composed presentation that I recognized as her version of armor. She wore a blazer I had seen in her social media photos, structured, expensive, the blazer of someone who needed to convey that things were fine even when they manifestly were not. She sat across from Gloria and from me at a conference table, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she looked at me with an expression that was trying to be neutral but was doing an imperfect job of it. Gloria said, "Thank you for coming, Renata. We have some information we want to share with you, and then we'd like to discuss options." Renata said, "Options for what?" Gloria set a binder on the table. It was one of 3 identical binders she had prepared, one for Renata, one for the record, one for me. She said, "For resolving some questions about your mother's estate." Renata looked at the binder. She looked at me. She put her hand on the binder and then did not open it. She said, "I don't understand why. Let me show you what we have," Gloria said in the precise, unhurried tone of someone who has been waiting a long time to say a sentence. "And then you will understand." The binder contained everything, every document, every date, every piece of testimony. Constance's written statement with her dated notes from October of 2019. Dr. Nwasu's cognitive assessment. The trust institution records with Petra Voswang's name. The bank employee's deposition. Harlan Price's account of the conversation before the will revision appointment, the conversation in which Renata had told him I had already agreed to the changes. Renata's hand, which had been resting on the closed binder, moved very slowly to the edge of the conference table. She gripped the edge with her fingers. She did not open the binder. She did not speak for a very long time. Gloria let the silence stand. I let the silence stand. That is something Gloria and I had discussed at length, that in this meeting we would not rush to fill the quiet. We would let Renata have the full weight of it. Finally, Renata said, "You're saying I manipulated Mom." I said, "I'm saying that the documentation suggests that you arranged for our mother to execute a trust at a time when her own neurologist had documented her cognitive vulnerability, that you used a third party to accompany her so that you would not appear directly in the records, and that you told her estate attorney that I had already agreed to changes that I had never been consulted about. I'm not asking you to respond to that right now. I'm asking you to read what's in front of you." She did not open the binder. I said, "Renata, this is not a conversation I wanted to have. I want you to believe that, even if you find it hard to. For 4 years, I did not come to you with this. For 4 years, I built a life and managed my work and showed up to family events and sent birthday cards. I did not come to you with this until you came to me." I paused. "I am coming to you with it now because you asked me for help. And I think the most honest version of help I can give you is this conversation." She looked at me. Her eyes were bright with something that was not quite tears. She said, "What do you want?" Gloria said, "We'd like to discuss a resolution." And that was the moment I had been building toward for 4 years. Not revenge exactly, not punishment exactly, something more precise than either of those words, a correction, a restoration of what had been taken. An acknowledgement, formal and documented and legally binding, that what had happened was wrong and that what was owed was real. We were not yet to the terms. We were not yet to the agreement or the settlement or the moment when everything would be settled. We were at the table. We were in the room. The binder was on the table between us, still unopened, and my sister's hand was on the edge of the conference table, and Gloria Tran was sitting to my left with the composed, focused expression of someone who had prepared for exactly this moment, and I was sitting in a chair in a law office in the city where I had lived my entire adult life, feeling something I had not been entirely sure I would feel when the moment arrived. I felt clear, not triumphant, not angry. Clear the way the air is clear after a long storm, when the pressure drops and the clouds move and you can see the full distance for the first time in weeks. I was still the capable one. I was still the practical one. I was still the daughter my mother had described to Constance in her last clear days, the one who always figured it out, but I was not invisible anymore. I was not the lesser daughter, the one who didn't need anything. I was a woman who had documented a wrong with patience and precision and the kind of quiet determination that most people never see coming until it is already at the table across from them. Renata opened the binder. If you're still with me, and I hope you are, because what happened next is the reason I am telling you this story, I want you to know that the conversation in that room lasted 3 hours and 12 minutes, and by the end of it, nothing was the same. The binder was open. The evidence was on the table, and after 4 years of silence, I was finally going to speak. Renata turned the first page slowly, the way someone moves when they are hoping that by going slowly enough, the words will rearrange themselves into something less damning. She read for 2 minutes without speaking. I watched her. Gloria watched her. The only sound in the conference room was the faint hum of the building's ventilation system and once the muffled sound of a phone ringing in an office down the hall. On page 3, the page with Constance's dated notes, Renata's hand stopped moving. She had been turning pages with the tips of her fingers, as if touching the documents lightly enough might diminish their significance. On page 3, she stopped entirely. She looked at Constance's handwriting, that familiar, precise cursive of a woman who had been a school teacher for 30 years and wrote everything as though it might be graded, and something shifted in her posture. Not a collapse, not yet. More like a very small, very controlled deflation, the kind that happens when a person realizes the thing they have been telling themselves is not going to hold. She looked up. Constance gave you a statement. Constance provided a written account of what she witnessed in October of 2019, Gloria said, in the same measured tone she had used since the meeting began. Dated the day after the incident, her own initiative. Constance has always, she and Nadia were always close. Renata's voice was trying to be dismissive, but the attempt didn't quite land. She stopped, started again. She was 70 years old then. Her memory is supplemented by contemporaneous written notes, Gloria said, which is, in legal terms, a significantly stronger evidentiary position than undocumented recollection. Renata set the binder down. She looked at me. And there it was, the thing I had been waiting to see, the thing underneath all the management and the narrative construction and the 4 years of careful positioning. She looked at me the way a person looks at someone when the architecture they have built around a truth finally becomes too expensive to maintain. She said, "What do you want, Nadia?" It was not a question. It was a reckoning dressed as a question. I said, "I want a resolution." "What does that mean?" Gloria opened her own copy of the binder to a tabbed section near the back. "We have prepared a proposal," she said. "I'd like to walk you through it." Renata looked at the binder. She looked at Gloria. She looked at me. Her hand went to her collarbone. She touched the thin chain of a necklace there just briefly, then lowered her hand to the table. "I came here," she said, "because I needed help. I came here because Nadia is my sister, and now her voice tightened. Now I'm sitting in a law office looking at, what is this exactly? Is this a lawsuit?" "It is a proposal for resolution," Gloria said, "which is preferable to a lawsuit for both of you." "Does it look preferable?" Renata's voice rose slightly. "Does this look like Renata?" I said her name quietly, just her name, and she stopped, because she knew that tone. She had heard it our entire lives. It was the tone I used when I was not going to argue, because I did not need to argue, because I was right and we both knew it. She pressed her lips together. Gloria walked her through the proposal. It was, in essence, this. We would not pursue active litigation challenging the trust, provided that Renata agreed to a structured restitution arrangement that would transfer to me, over a period of 18 months, the sum of $735,000. That number represented my share of the estate as it should have been calculated under the terms of the pre-2020 will, the equal split that had been in place for the 14 months prior to the will revision, including the trust assets, and accounting for the attorney's fees I had accumulated over 4 years of documentation work. I watched Renata's face as Gloria read the number. The color started leaving her face from the top down, which is unusual. Most people lose color in the center of their face, around the mouth and nose. Renata's forehead went first, then her cheeks, then finally the line of her jaw. She said, $735,000. In structured payments over 18 months, Gloria confirmed. Which, given the asset position outlined in your financial disclosure to Nadia last week, is achievable without requiring the sale of the River North property. Renata had provided the financial disclosure voluntarily, as a show of good faith when she called me, trying to demonstrate the genuineness of her need. I had asked her in our follow-up call to put it in writing and email it to me. She had done so. She had done so because she needed the loan and because providing documentation seemed like the kind of responsible thing that would make her request more credible. She had not known that she was providing a financial roadmap that Gloria and I had spent 2 weeks analyzing. Renata touched the necklace chain again. "I don't have $735,000 in liquid assets." "We're aware," Gloria said. "That is why we've structured it as payments." "But the source of those payments would have to be—" Renata stopped. She was doing the math. I could see her doing it, running through her own balance sheet, the condo equity, the remaining investment accounts, the small amount of cash she still had liquid. "I would have to sell something. Or refinance," Gloria said, "or both. We're not prescribing the mechanism, we're specifying the outcome." Renata looked at me for a long time. Then she said something that I had not expected her to say, and it was the most honest thing she had said in the entire meeting, maybe in years. She said, "I didn't think you knew about the trust." I let that sit in the room. "I didn't think anyone knew," she said. I thought it had been handled carefully enough that—" She stopped herself. Her hand was flat on the table now, pressing down as if she needed the solidity of it. "God," a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a breath. You knew the whole time." "Not the whole time," I said, "a few weeks after the estate closed." "And you just—" She looked at me with something I could not immediately name. It took me a moment to recognize it as a strange, complicated species of respect. "You just waited." "I waited for 4 years." "Yes." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "And if I hadn't called you, if I hadn't needed—" "That is a question I'm not going to answer," I said, "because the answer doesn't change where we are right now." That was true. But the full truth was more complicated, and I knew it, and I think she knew it too. The full truth was that I had hoped she would call, that the version of this story in which she never called, in which she managed her money carefully and lived quietly on what she had taken and never needed anything from me, was a version I had prepared for but not preferred, not because I wanted her to fail, but because if she never called, there was no path to correction. There was only the permanent fact of the wrong, unremedied, sitting at the edge of everything like a stone in a shoe I could never fully remove. She had called, and that meant there was a path. Gloria gave Renata 10 days to consult her own attorney and consider the proposal. In those 10 days, I went to work every morning and managed my clients and attended my meetings and ordered lunch at my desk at noon. And I felt, for the first time in 4 years, a lightness that I had not realized I was missing until it began to return. It was not happiness exactly. It was something closer to equilibrium. The weight of carrying something that nobody else could see was lifting incrementally, and the difference was remarkable. Renata's attorney called Gloria on day 8. The attorney was a woman named Iris Nakamura, who practiced estate law and was, by Gloria's assessment when I asked, both competent and realistic. She had reviewed our documentation. She had advised Renata on her exposure. And she was calling, Iris Nakamura said, to discuss the terms. They negotiated for 3 days. The final agreement differed from our initial proposal in 2 respects. The structured payment period was extended to 24 months rather than 18, which I accepted, and the total amount was adjusted to $690,000, slightly less than our opening number, which I also accepted because Gloria had built the opening number with room to negotiate and because $690,000 was, in any real assessment, the right number. It was what was owed. The agreement contained, at my insistence, one additional clause that Iris Nakamura had resisted, and then, after a conversation I was not present for but that Gloria described as efficient, accepted. The clause required that the agreement be filed with the court as a consent judgment, making it enforceable as a court order rather than a private contract. If Renata missed a payment, I could pursue enforcement without initiating a new lawsuit. I would simply file a motion. Renata signed the consent judgment on a Wednesday afternoon in Iris Nakamura's office. I was present. Gloria was present. Iris Nakamura was professional and precisely neutral in the way of attorneys who have advised their clients that the terms are as good as they are going to get. Renata signed with a pen from Iris Nakamura's desk, a plain black ballpoint. Her hand moved steadily across the signature line. She did not look at me when she signed. She looked at the paper, and her jaw was set in the particular way of someone who has made peace with a thing they cannot change, and she put the pen down and folded her hands in her lap. Gloria signed as the representative of record. I signed as the accepting party. Iris Nakamura notarized it, and just like that, after 4 years and 3 months and 11 days, it was over. Or rather, it was not over. It was beginning in the technical sense that the payments had not yet been made. But the legal architecture of it was complete. The wrong had been named, and the remedy had been agreed to, and the court had been made aware. The story my sister had spent 4 years telling, the one in which I was a consenting participant, in which my mother's choices had been freely made, in which what had happened was simply an estate settling in the way estates settle, that story was no longer the only story. It was not even the official story anymore. The official story was in the court filing. And the court filing said what had happened. I drove home that evening on the same route I had driven for 11 years, Lake Shore Drive south, then west toward Lincoln Park, past the same landmarks in the same order. The lake was gray and very flat in the early evening light. A running path along the shore was busy with the particular crowd of early evening runners, people in bright jackets moving at various speeds with the focused, slightly private expressions of people doing something for themselves. I had run that path hundreds of times. I had run it in the months after my mother died, when running was the only thing that reliably quieted the noise in my head. I had run it in the weeks after the estate reading, when the ground had still felt slightly tilted under me and motion was the only cure for stillness. I drove past it and watched the runners for a moment through the window and felt something that I can only describe imprecisely as grateful. Not grateful that things had worked out, not grateful in a tidy, lesson-learned way. Just grateful for the fact of the path and the light and the gray lake and the 11 years I had spent building a life that nobody could take from me, no matter what they took from the estate. That part I had always had. I just needed to remember it was enough. What followed over the next 3 months was not dramatic. It was administrative. Renata made her first payment on schedule, $115,000, wired to an account that Gloria managed on my behalf. The wire cleared on a Thursday morning. Gloria texted me a single word, confirmed. I texted back, thank you. I went back to work. There was, however, one more scene. I had not planned it, and in retrospect, I am not entirely sure it was necessary, but it happened, and I am going to tell you about it because the story would be incomplete without it. My extended family had been gathering in November of every year for as long as I could remember, a loose, sprawling Thanksgiving-adjacent dinner that my Aunt Rosaline had hosted for decades at her house in Evanston. It was the gathering of approximately 20 people that I have already described. It was the gathering where, in February of 2021, Renata had told Troy Wakahissa that I had been consulted on the will. It was the gathering where Rosaline had appeared at my elbow with sparkling water and the sentence, "Don't let her write the story." In November of 2024, 4 weeks after Renata signed the consent judgment, the November gathering happened as it always had. I had debated whether to attend. There was a version of this in which attending felt unnecessary, even slightly cruel. Renata would be there, and the consent judgment was still very fresh, and some people in the family knew that something had transpired between us even if they did not know the details. I could have stayed home. I could have sent regrets and a nice bottle of wine and let the family process whatever it was processing without my presence complicating it. I went. I went because Rosaline had told me not to let Renata write the story, and the story was still being written, and the only way to participate in its authorship was to show up. The gathering was at Rosaline's house, the same wide Victorian in Evanston that had held 30 years of family events, with the same darkwood dining room and the same slightly too warm kitchen, and the same photos along the stairwell that documented the entire sprawling timeline of the Ferrara-Conquo family in chronological order from the 1960s to the present. There was a photo of my mother on that stairwell from 1982, young, laughing at something off camera, her hair in the style of the decade, looking nothing at all like the diminished version of herself that the final years had imposed. I always stopped at that photo on my way up to leave my coat. I stopped at it that evening. Renata was already there when I arrived. She was in the living room talking to our cousin Adiz Ferrer-Ape, and when I walked in, she looked at me across the room with an expression that I could not entirely read. It was careful and it was tired, and there was something in it that was not hostility but was also not the uncomplicated warmth that had characterized her approach to me in the 4 years when she had believed she held all the cards. I nodded at her. She nodded at me. Adiz, who had no idea what had recently transpired between us, waved me over with the comfortable enthusiasm of a person who is entirely unaware of the subtext she is standing in. I went over. I hugged Adiz. I said hello to my sister. Renata said, "You came." I said, "I always come to Rosaline's." There was a beat. Then Renata said, "Can we talk later? Not now, but before the end of the night." I said, "Of course." The dinner itself was the dinner it always was, loud and crowded and organized around the particular kind of argument that large families have at holiday tables, which is the kind of argument that sounds serious but is actually a form of affection. Troy Wakahissa had brought a new girlfriend whom nobody had met before, and the girlfriend was charming and slightly overwhelmed, and by the end of the evening had been adopted, as all Ferrara-Conquo newcomers eventually were, by my Aunt Rosaline, who had the gift of making strangers feel like family within approximately 90 minutes. Rosaline sat across from me at dinner. At one point, when the conversation around us was loud enough to cover a private exchange, she leaned forward and said very quietly, "I heard that things were resolved." I said they were resolved. She looked at me for a moment with her particular expression, measured deep, the expression of someone who has been watching a family for 78 years and has long since made her peace with the fact that families are complicated in ways that resist simple judgment. She said, "Good." And then she leaned back and rejoined the larger conversation, and that was the only thing either of us said about it. After dinner, Renata found me in the back hallway near the coat room. The noise of the party was muffled there, audible but removed, the way sound travels through old houses with thick walls. She had her arms crossed, not defensively, but more as though she was cold, even though the house was warm. She said, "I've been thinking about what to say to you." I waited. I keep starting to say I didn't know what I was doing and then stopping myself because that's not entirely true. She looked at the floor for a moment. I knew Mom was, I knew she wasn't always clear. I knew the timing was, I told myself that she had always wanted to help me more than she helped you, that the will was just formalizing what was already true. She looked up. I told myself that story for a long time. I said, "I know, the Petra thing." Her voice was quieter now. "I'm not going to explain that. I don't think there's an explanation that works." "No," I said, "there isn't." She uncrossed her arms and let them drop to her sides. She looked like someone who had been carrying something for a very long time and had only just set it down and was trying to remember how to stand without it. She said, "I don't expect you to forgive me. I'm not asking for that. I know. I just wanted to." She stopped, started again. "I wanted you to know that I know. That I know what it was. I'm not going to keep telling myself the other version." I thought about that for a moment. I thought about Constance, sitting across from me at the cafe in Wilmette, telling me that my mother had been proud of me, that my mother had said I would figure it out. I thought about 4 years of heart emojis and thoughtful gifts and standing calls with Gloria Tran. I thought about the certified copy of the will and the yellow highlighter and the word March circled on a legal pad. I said, "I appreciate that." She nodded. Then she said, "Are you okay? I mean, are you actually okay? Because I know She made a small, incomplete gesture that seemed to refer to everything she had already said. I thought about the question honestly before I answered it. I said, "I'm going to be okay, yes." She said, "Good." Her voice was very quiet. I'm glad." We stood in the hallway for another moment. Then the sound of Rosaline's voice from the dining room rose in laughter at something, and the party reasserted itself, and Renata went back toward the noise and I went to get my coat, and that was the last private conversation we had that evening and for a long time after. I do not know what Renata and I will be to each other eventually. I genuinely do not know. The payments have continued on schedule. We have exchanged texts a few times, brief, neutral texts about family logistics, nothing weighted. She has not asked me for anything, and I have not offered anything, and I think we are both living, for now, in the clean space that comes after a thing has been resolved and before anyone knows what comes next. What I know is that I do not hate her. I need you to hear that clearly because I think it would be easy to tell this story in a way that requires hatred at the end of it, and that would not be honest. I do not hate my sister. I understand her, which is different. I understand the mechanism that produced her, the specific damage of being raised as someone who deserved to be taken care of, who was treated as precious and fragile and therefore never required to be accountable. That damage was real. It produced real consequences. And those consequences are hers to reckon with now, not mine. What I also know is that I spent 4 years invisible, and I am not invisible anymore. Not because the money changed something fundamental about my circumstances. I was already fine in the literal sense of the word. I was always fine. But there is a difference between being fine and being witnessed, between doing the right thing and having the record reflect it, between accepting a wrong quietly and requiring it to be named. My name is Nadia Ferreira Conquo. I am 38 years old. I work as a senior portfolio manager in Chicago, and I have a client book that I built over 15 years with nothing but competence and consistency and the willingness to read the fine print. I live in Lincoln Park in the apartment I have owned outright for 8 years. I run along Lake Shore Drive in the evenings when the weather allows, past the gray lake and the city lights beginning to appear in the distance, and I feel most evenings, on most runs, something that I can only call mine. The feeling of occupying a life that nobody else designed and nobody else can revise. Last month, I walked past the photo of my mother on Rosaline's stairwell, the one from 1982, the one where she is laughing at something off camera, and I stood there for a full minute. And I said something to her quietly in my head that I had been wanting to say for 4 years and had not quite found the words for. I told her that I had figured it out, that she had been right about that. And that I understood now why she had said it to Constance instead of to me, because some things a parent cannot say directly to a child without the weight of it collapsing the distance, and so they say it sideways through a friend in a way the child might find later when they need it most. I found it when I needed it most. The first payment cleared in October. The second cleared in December. 6 more will follow on schedule as the consent judgment requires. And when the last one clears in a little under 2 years, on a morning that will look like any other morning, with coffee and a legal pad and probably some other crisis I have not yet anticipated that will need to be managed, I will have recovered not just what was taken, but something I did not expect the process to return. The absolute, unshakable knowledge that I do not need anyone to see my value in order for it to exist. I have known it quietly for years. Now the court record knows it too. The document is filed. The fine print has been read. The story has its right author. If you're carrying something heavy right now, something that other people are counting on you to carry quietly, something that you have been told is just the way things are, I want you to know that the fine print exists in every situation. There is always a clause that someone forgot to read. There is always evidence that someone forgot to preserve. The question is whether you are willing to be the one who shows up at the table with a yellow highlighter and the patience to use it. Hit that like button if this story stayed with you. Share it with someone who needs to hear that patience is not the same as surrender. And drop the word documented in the comments below if you're done letting someone else write your story. I read every single one, and I will see you there.